Good evening. Oh, it works. I'm Paula Podemski, and I'm the company manager here at Seattle Opera, and I welcome you to this celebration of life for our very special friend and colleague, Ernesto Alorda. Gee, it's great to see people in person! With a warm smile and a dignified grace, Ernesto tirelessly served Seattle Opera and its artists and our community for over 30 years. He started as a volunteer with the Seattle Opera Guild in 1978, then joined the staff in 1983. He worked in the PR department, wining and dining the press on opening night and serving as a true ambassador for the company and the art form. Later, Ernesto became the artist relations manager, helping hundreds of artists, from singers to directors, choreographers, costume designers, set designers, lighting designers, stage directors, and conductors. He coordinated hundreds of housing units, thousands of flights, unknown numbers of doctor's appointments, and who knows how many trips to the Social Security office downtown. And then there were the visas. It's safe to say that in the world of opera, when artists thought about Seattle Opera, they thought of Ernesto, who made them feel safe, valued, and well cared for. Ernesto and I hit it off right off the bat when I started in 1993, and were close colleagues until his retirement. We even traveled to distant lands together where others thought he and I were married, a story he loved to tell over and over. What may be a little-known fact about Ernesto, he was an avid fan of classic film star Deborah Kerr and collected her memorabilia. I dubbed him the unofficial international president of the Deborah Kerr fan club, where I learned he had seen all her movies more times than one can count, and he owned them as well. Such a fan of the classic movies that he once exclaimed, "I love the cinema, but for me it ended in 1965. He knew everything about her husband, the screenwriter Peter Vertel. On one trip to Spain, we found ourselves in the southern town of Marbella, where Mr. Vertel lived. Ernesto was hell-bent on finding his house. After hours of driving and asking every man on the street we could, we actually came upon his neighborhood, where a gardener led us to Mr. Vertel's house and knocked on the door for us. In Spanish, "Mr. Vertel, you have visitors from the United States." Mr. Vertel actually gave us an audience for about 15 minutes. Ernesto doing all the talking, of course. I was agog. This was the man who wrote On the Waterfront and 2 screenplays from Hemingway novels. And Ernesto, the tireless detective, hunted him down. This is just one of the many adventures I will treasure with Ernesto. I am sure our speakers will share some stories with you tonight as well. Our first speaker is Roger van Oosten. Roger and his wife Gina have been close friends with Ernesto and Jonathan for 30 years, and we're like family, sharing holidays and many gatherings together. Roger?
Good evening. I think I'm a little taller than. Can you hear me? I remember the day Ernesto Alorda stormed down to the marketing department demanding that his name be removed from the Seattle Opera magazine. In those days, you always heard Ernesto before you saw him. Ernesto, why do you want your name removed from the magazine? Look, he said, look. We had hired opera critic Stephanie Van Oosten to write a review of her favorite recording of some opera. To listen to this recording, she wrote, "You must have brass cojones. Take that word cojones out or my name off the publication. It's vulgar. I won't be associated with it." You always knew when Ernesto was upset. He didn't hide things. Needless to say, we removed the word. Others will mention to you how much Ernesto loved opera and loved Seattle Opera. I want to tell you about the man. I want to tell you that he lived an operatic life. Everything, even simple copy edits to the magazine, were done with a flourish and drama Emotions were expressed out in the open. He was larger than life. He brought an electric charge to the workplace. He was theatrical. The office was a stage, and he was unquestionably the star. He held court during the work week, always telling interesting stories about his life, like the time in the mid-1960s when he was in the Army and stationed at the Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah, where they do chemical and biological weapons testing. One day he found himself in a squad of soldiers parked in the middle of the desert around hundreds of dead sheep and ordered to remove those sheep and dispose of them. I can't reconcile a picture of Ernesto tossing dead sheep into the back of a truck with the man that I knew, but it did happen, and he made it happen. Nor can I come to terms with the day he came into the office declaring he had seen the funniest, greatest movie of all time. He said, "It's called Porky's." Among his deep repertoire of stories, he loved to recount the day that someone pulled him aside and told him, well, there didn't seem to be a spot for him on the old org chart. "No one can fire me," he said, and stormed off. And of course, he was right. Ernesto was essential. He had a passion for opera, and the company flowed along with that passion. It drove us all forward. He had an incomparable talent for conversation. He would bring out the best in people in social situations. He drew people in, made them feel special. For 25 years, he attended the holiday cocktail parties my wife and I would throw at our home. Leaving, our friends would say, "I met Ernesto, he's wonderful." He could talk about many subjects, but his favorite topics were opera, old movies, and Deborah Kerr over and over. One night we were having a conversation about classic actors, and I mentioned Spencer Tracy. "He was gay, you know," he said. "No, he wasn't." "Yes," said Ernesto, "it's all in the books." "What about Cary Grant?" "He lived with Randolph Scott, of course he was gay." "Clark Gable?" "Yes, definitely gay." I kept serving up names, and he kept knocking them back like a one-sided tennis match. Fred Astaire, gay. Errol Flynn, gay. Howard Keel, Tony Curtis. Finally, I remembered one Lothario. Gotcha, Tyrone Power. He was gay. Ernesto, he was a womanizer. Roger, that is how he hid it from the press. Game, set, and match. Ernesto always got the last word. Over his life of being socially adept, he ended up knowing everyone, literally. We were having lunch one day, I think Monty and Sarah, and probably Tina. We were having lunch at the Hutch, and a very distinguished man walked up and said, "Ernesto, how are you, sir?" "Don, so good to see you," Ernest replied. Any new discoveries? Don turned out to be E. Donald Thomas, the discoverer of bone marrow transplantation and a Nobel Prize winner. And they just had a conversation right there. In 1997, Seattle Opera sent Ernesto and me down to Los Angeles to see a performance of Florencia en el Amazonas, a new work the opera had commissioned with LA Opera and Houston Grand Opera. Our job was to see the opera and learn how they had marketed it. We had an afternoon free. I'd lived in LA for several years with my wife, and I wanted to give him a great tour of the city. I had it all planned out, La Brea Tar Pits, the Getty, everything. We get in the car, he says, "Take me to Hollywood and Vine." I said, "Oh, I got a plan here." And he said, yes, take me to Hollywood and Vine. So I thought, that's not a bad place to start. So away we went. I parked, he jumped out of the car and immediately started scouring the sidewalks. And then, not finding what he wanted, he cut diagonally across the street like they do in the movies, with cars honking and screeching their brakes. And I'm waiting for a light, and he goes, I found it. And it was Deborah Kerr's star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. So then we get back in the car, he gives me another address. This is a school she attended in the 40s. This is Deborah Kerr's first house. This is Deborah Kerr's second house. We aren't touring Los Angeles, we're touring Deborah Kerr's Los Angeles. Finally, we come to a short street in Malibu lined with houses down both sides that dead ends on the Pacific Ocean. We're slowly driving down the street, and I can see he's looking at the house numbers. "There, pull up in front of that house," he said. I said, weary, "Did Deborah Kerr live here too?" "No," he said. "This is the house of Salka Firtel. She lived here in the 1930s. Salka was Deborah Kerr's mother-in-law. Let's go see if anybody's home." Wait, what? "Well, the owners might not know the history of the house," he said. "Come on." So he walked up the front door and he knocked, but there was no answer. He was disappointed. I was relieved. But he rebounded. He said, "Let's walk down to the beach like Deborah Kerr and Greta Garbo used to do. I'll be Deborah," he said. Which left me playing Garbo, I suppose. And we walked down to the ocean, and he told me the tales of Salka's house. It was a gathering place for expatriate artists and composers, and they went there and they had parties and discussions and conversations that lasted until the wee hours of the morning. He was happy, ecstatic, in his element as I'd never seen him before. I realized that if he could travel through time, he wouldn't go anywhere. He would come back to this street, to Salka's house, with Garba and with Deborah. We reached the ocean, turned around, and headed back to the car. As we walked up to the street, a car pulled out of the driveway that used to belong to Salka Fertel. Suddenly, without warning, Ernesto took off. Usain Bolt, on his best day, never traveled so fast. Stop! Stop the car! Stop the car! Stop the car! Stop! And the car did stop. And he ran up to the window and knocked on the window of the car. The driver rolled it down. And then Ernesto just couldn't contain himself. He couldn't stop. He said, "Did you know that this was once Salka Fertel's house and Deborah Carr used to live in a garden?" He just kept going. It flowed out of him. And then when he ran out of steam, he said, "Well, that's the story of your house. I just thought you should know." As you can guess, there was an awkward silence for a moment. Then the driver said, "Ernesto? Ernesto Alorda? How are you, my friend?" The driver had known Ernesto from the NEA years before. I repeat, he knew everyone. Ernesto was larger than life, and he made life seem larger for all of us when he was living. And now he's gone and life seems smaller. He's not out there anymore disposing of dead sheep or searching for Deborah's star or questioning a garbage man in Spain to find Deborah's house. But these things did happen, and I'm here to tell you that all his stories were true. I will always remember you, Ernesto. Goodbye, my friend. I miss you. I love you. But you're wrong about Tyrone Power.
Thank you, Roger. I'm glad you came after me and that I did not have to make my remarks. That was great. The great tenor Jose Carreras came to Seattle in the late 1980s for treatment at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. By some fantastic break, Ernesto got connected with the wonderful tenor. They became fast friends and stayed in touch for many years. Senor Carreras wrote to Jonathan, "I wish to pay tribute to Ernesto Alorda, whom I met at Seattle Opera when he was the Community and Artist Relations Director of the theater. I keep very nice memories of that time and remember his support while I was under treatment at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. It was always a pleasure to meet and chat with him. It was a nice friendship that endured in time. It is a pity that he has passed away. We all will miss him, Jose Carreras." Our first musical moment is with a tenor very beloved to Seattle Opera and Ernesto, Doug Jones. Doug made a Seattle Opera debut in Tristan and Isolde in 1998 and went on to sing in some 20 productions. He also has performed all over the world: Paris, London, Tel Aviv, Vienna, Barcelona, Frankfurt, and others. Doug is accompanied by Seattle Opera's own Jay Rozendaal. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Jay. It's beautiful. Our next speaker is longtime opera volunteer Nancy Fosmire. Assisting Ernesto with running the Artist Aid program, Nancy gave tirelessly to this effort for 25 years. Nancy?
So I don't know how many of you know that besides just dealing with visas and all the other little details of taking care of the artist, Ernesto was also a property manager. Well, you know, artists needed some help, and so they bought a condo in Seattle for when they were singing here, and when they were singing somewhere else, well, it could be rented out to another singer, and Ernesto ended up doing all of that, in addition to his normal duties. And so sometimes I would get these phone calls like, oh, so-and-so's, you know, needs to be picked up at the airport because they're going to be staying in so-and-so's condo. And these, of course, were not necessarily, usually they were somebody who was going to be involved in Seattle Opera, but not always. And his enthusiasm for taking care of everybody knew no bounds. He was just one of the most helpful, kind people you could imagine. That didn't mean that when something happened that he wasn't happy with, that he didn't sort of explode, but because Ernesto was enthusiastic about everything. But if you needed something and there was anything he could do for you, he did it. Between us, we chased down babysitters who spoke a certain language, cribs, high chairs, playpens, children's doctors, all sorts of interesting things that you don't think of as being part of an opera production. And there were, you know, because we all, you know, there was not just singers. We had stage directors and conductors and set designers and costume designers and all sorts of various people who were all involved at different times. So there were a lot of people coming and going. We had, at one point, we had 65 artist aides, and rehearsals were going 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. So there were a lot of different people coming and going, and keeping track of all of that was sort of joint venture between Ernesto, myself, and stage manager. So, but it was always with, we're here to make the life of these artists better, easier, more comfortable at all times. And sometimes when something unfortunate happened, there were long discussions about who we could have drive this person who wasn't going to, who would understand and be especially supportive in those conditions. And that was always, what can we do to make the life of these people better? And he always did it with kindness and enthusiasm. And if it took phone calls at 3 o'clock in the morning, which I think that only happened once, but I had some phone calls at some pretty strange times on occasion. Because he enjoyed having a colleague to work with on things. He really liked working with other people. And I'll miss his enthusiasm, his gracefulness, his dapper, always, no matter what, he always looked put together and suave. And we'll all miss him.
Thank you, Nancy. Suave he was. Ernesto's brother Raul and Jonathan's father Phil could not be here tonight. Raul sent remarks, which will be read by Jonathan, and Phil wrote a poem to be read by family friend Roberta Lyon.
When I think of my brother Ernesto, there are three words that come to mind: music, family, and class. My brother loved classical music since he was a very young boy. As young as 4 or 5, our mother would sit down and listen to classical music concerts on the radio with him. And not only would Ernesto sit there and listen with her, but he would break the clothes hanger into 2 pieces so he could use them to conduct while the concert was on. By 6 or 7, whenever my parents couldn't find Ernesto around the house or in the neighborhood, they would find him down at the auditorium where he had walked to all alone, listening to music from the outside. Ernesto loved Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals too. I remember when he first fell in love with the love of his life, Deborah Carr. He would dance down the hallway of our apartment in Havana to The King and I, Shall We Dance? In fact, he and Jonathan once went to Spain to try to meet her. And although he wasn't able to meet her personally, he did meet her husband, Peter Viertel, as you've seen. Now my brother and I have very different interests. My first love was baseball, playing it and listening to games, all of it. If you can imagine the two of us sharing a room, each of us listening to our own radios at a pretty high volume at the same time. Classical music or opera on his radio and baseball on mine. The racket was impressive. Like most other brothers, Ernesto loved to tease his younger siblings. He knew exactly how to bother our sister Lourdes and I, and would constantly tease and drive us crazy. Ernesto was always outspoken, and after the revolution happened in Cuba, our parents saw how dangerous it would be to be in Cuba, so they decided to get him out first. They gave him the option of going to Miami, where some of our family was going, or to New York City, where he had one aunt. Of course, he chose New York City. It was September of 1960 when he was 20 years old. Luckily, he met the perfect person to board with, Mrs. Henningsen, a German woman who loved music and opera. I mean, it could not be more perfect. By the next year, my sister, who was a year younger than Ernesto, also arrived in New York City and finally had gotten there too. And the three of us moved into a studio apartment. I was 15, going on 16, and still in high school, and Ernesto was my guardian. All this time, Ernesto was holding down a full-time job, a part-time job at the Waldorf Astoria, running the elevators, and then he volunteered at Carnegie Hall and Lincoln Center so he could watch operas and listen to music for free. Now remember, Ernesto had finished school before coming to the US, so when I got my first report card, he asked me, Raul, what is a D, F, and U? What do those mean? And I explained to the teachers that they were giving my grades in Spanish to be nice to me, and that D meant de particular, F was for fabuloso, and U meant I was ready for the universidad. And for those that don't speak Spanish, let's just say basically I told them I was doing a great job. In 1964, Ernesto was drafted into the US Army and was lucky enough to be sent to Germany. The opera fan that he was, he took the opportunity to learn German, even volunteering for an extra year in the service to truly learn the language. When he came back from the Army, he went to Salt Lake City, where he worked at the opera there. He also volunteered at a radio station during this time where he was on the air and would speak about classical music and opera. After a few years, he moved to the city that would become his home and love, Seattle. It is here in this city that he fell in love with the second heart after Havana. Although we all lived far apart, Ernesto made it a point to spend time with family. He'd visit my sister and her family in Atlanta, all of our cousins in Miami, and my family and I in New York City. My daughters have always remembered the Christmas when he came to visit us in New York. When they were still very young, he of course gave them gifts to introduce them to classical music. They still both remember Peter and the Wolf on vinyl records, as well as tapes of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake and the 1812 Overture, among others. In fact, my brother's passion for family went so far as to take him to Mexico, where he had found distant relatives we didn't even know about. My brother was always a perfect gentleman. He exuded class and sophistication. He could have been a leading man for one of those classic movies from the golden age of Hollywood that he so enjoyed. Ernesto was a force and will always be missed by our family, his friends, and all the people whose lives were touched by his generous spirit. We love you, hermano. Roberta?
Saying Goodbye to Havana and Ernesto Alorda de Cardenas by Phil Gerson, inspired by a poem by Ruth Behar, Saying Goodbye to Havana. There's always that last day in Havana when I want to fix the city in my memory. I want to take another walk on the Malecon, when I want to lose myself in the hustle and the bustle on Calle Obispo. I want to feel the sea wetting my eyelids. Loss of a homeland of rich culture with the de Cardenas family from Spain, settling in Cuba in 1493. In Havana, a home filled with music, his parents devoted to piano and walks to the nearby symphony. Absorbing the rich Cuban musical heritage and famous European artists' expressions of life in their operas. Of happy times with family in Miami and so many cousins. A privileged life ended so rapidly after 1959, taking only a few of their hard-earned possessions. Coming to New York City in 1960, on to Salt Lake City, and finally, Seattle, Ernesto's inner Cubano spirit never died. We all experienced his joy and appreciation of Seattle opera and Speight Jenkins. 31 years with Jonathan, gifting back his love and support, at first helping this young man in his journey to love and acceptance in his life. Then the opera years, followed by Jonathan gifting back his love and support in the waning years. Also remembering the loving relationship between Ernesto and Jonathan's mother, Ellen, as she supported our son-in-law tending to opera singers' needs. I truly love this handsome man, his zest for life, for introducing me to opera, for our travels and laughs shared as a family. So, there's always that last day to say goodbye to Ernesto. When I want to fix him in my memory, I want to take another walk in the Arboretum. When I want to lose myself in the hustle and the bustle of opera's opening night, I am feeling the tears wetting my eyelids. Muchas gracias, Ernesto, for all the joy you have shared. May your soul rest in peace.
Thank you both. Those were quite touching and informative, too. Speight Jenkins was General Director of Seattle Opera for 31 years and, of course, worked very closely with Ernesto. They started at Seattle Opera on the same day. Now with some remembrances, Speight.
the first person from Seattle Opera to meet me was Ernesto, when I came out here to lecture on the Ring, and he picked me up, brought me back to the apartment, and we talked about things, and I asked him what he did. And he was, of course, immediately affable and helpful and everything. And he told me that he brought people in from the airport, that he took care of this, that, and the other. And I said, well, what's your position in the opera? And he said, well, I don't have a position in the opera. I just do things they ask me to do. And I said, well, how much do you do? And he went on to say it. And I said, and you don't work for them? And he said, no. And I said, well, that's going to change. And well, that actually was the second time we met, when I was coming back to be general director, because he was my very first hire in the opera. Because I said nobody could do the work that he did and not justify working for us. He did many things at the opera. For years, he was the press representative and made friends with the press, was superb in what he did at that. But of course, the most important thing in the latter years of his life there was working with the artist aides. There, as was said earlier, I think there are 60 artist aides at times. I didn't know that. But, you know, these are volunteers. And Ernesto never one time complained to me about an artist aide. He never one time said to me that they were difficult. Not that they are difficult. Of course, they're the most remarkable people in the world. But they are volunteers. And they do have ideas, and he had to take care of them. And he did take care of them and make them happy. Because the artist aides, you know, in every company, nowadays, every opera company in America brings the singers, volunteers bring the singers at the airport and bring them back. But what the artist aides did here was much more. Not only did they take them to the grocery store and do things, after they had come and settled down, after they were singing, if they needed to go to the doctor, if they needed to do anything else, the artist aides would come and take them. And this was something that was really remarkable. No other opera company had as much involvement as we did. And it was Ernesto that made all this work. He, of course, really loved opera, as we've said here. I don't think he ever missed a dress rehearsal. He was, of course, particularly loyal to anything that involved the Spanish language. And he loved Cuban singers. He loved everybody connected with it. But his greatest loyalty was to Montserrat Caballé. I never brought her here when he was here. I never brought her here. It just didn't work out that I could. But even though she was from Barcelona, she was a Catalan, he considered her, he was Spanish, she was the great Spanish singer, and he adored her. He really worshiped her. And was always involved, but he was always involved with everything connected with opera. But the Spanish was very important to him, the Spanish singers, everything about it. I think that one thing that I need to say here, which has not been said before, but I want to say it, is a tribute to Jonathan too, because Jonathan has been wonderful to Ernesto in every possible way. And in these last years, when it was very difficult, Jonathan did what few people have ever done in the caring for him, in making him feel good, in doing everything. It's a great tribute. I mean, it's a tribute to Ernesto, but it was a tribute to Jonathan. And I feel that I know all of us know this, but I think on an occasion like this, it's important to say that he was totally, unbelievably remarkable, so far as I'm concerned. I do have one good... I do have one good story about Ernesto. Ernesto was a maniac about driving rules. I never understood why, because I don't think he ever got a ticket. But if it said 35 miles an hour, he drove that. If it said 25 miles an hour, he drove that. If he saw a yellow line on the street, he wouldn't go over it. When I was walking with him, I said, just go on and turn. No, I won't do that. I have to follow the rules. Now, I don't know whether it's because he got tickets or whether I don't know what it was, but I've never known anybody so absolutely determined to follow every single rule that could happen on the road, except one time. This is a little bit of a longer story, but a few years ago we did Lakme. And in those days, there was a time when the first cast sang, the second cast sang like on a Friday night, then they didn't sing until the next Sunday, not that Sunday, but the Sunday afterwards. And so when Bill Burden, who was Vincent Cole was the first tenor, Bill Burden was the second. And Bill asked me, he said he needed to go home to Connecticut, and he wanted to do it. And I said, well, Vincent's always healthy. It's all right. Of course you can do it. You know, the typical mistake of a general director believing that he's going to get what he wants. So Bill went home. And on the Thursday before the last performance, Vincent called me and said, I've got a tickle in my throat that I don't like. Well, of course, the next day it was worse. And he said, but I can do it. He kept saying, I can do it. But the day before, he said, Speight, I can't. So I called Bill in the morning of the morning of the show. He was in Connecticut with his family, and I said, you got to get out here right now. And he said, okay, fine. So we followed him in the car. He got stuck on the bridge going to Kennedy, and we talked about that. He went through. He got to the airport. This was long before 9/11, or not before. He got to the airport, and they said, the plane's doors have closed. He said, they can't close. 3,000 people are waiting for me in Seattle. I've got to get there. And he ran to the gate, and they actually, in those days, they opened the gate, and he went through and got in the car. So when he landed, it was Ernesto that picked him up. And this is the point to my story. Ernesto, there was no time to do it. And according to people who knew, according to what Bill told me, he broke every rule of the plan coming in. He drove faster than possible, and he constantly and he got him here. And the first act of that opera, Vincent had said, I can do the first act. He did. When the second act came in, there was Bill in his uniform, and that was totally because of Ernesto, of what he accomplished. So it's the legacy of Ernesto is great. What he did for the artists, what he meant for us all, how important he loved Seattle Opera and what it meant to him. It was so very, except for Jonathan, it was the most important thing in his life, I think. And he was great at it. He worked wonderfully, and he was a great joy for me to know him and to get to work with him all those years. Thank you.
Thank you, Speight. That was great. Ernesto had a special relationship with our next artist, Eglise Guttierez. Both from Cuba, Eglise and Ernesto were buddies from the start. Eglise has appeared all over the world, but for Seattle, she sang in I Puritani, La Traviata, and Lucia de Lammermoor. Eglise could not come, but sent this lovely tribute in song. She is accompanied by her pianist, Roberto Berrocal.
Oh,
wish to thank Eglise for sending that beautiful tribute. Finally, I would like to welcome Jonathan Gerson. Jonathan and Ernesto enjoyed 31 years together. With music, travel, good friends, and family, they've built a fulfilling life together. Jonathan?
Friends, Ernesto and I met at a bar in Seattle called The Ritz. I spotted his handsome, aristocratic-looking Cuban, this Cuban from across the room. He said emphatically that young people don't know who Deborah Carr is. That's actually the first thing he said. I quickly replied that I was working on some scenes from the University of Washington Drama School from The King and I, and that yes, I knew who Deborah Carr is. He was very impressed that a young person knew of his favorite star. So he invited me to see Tales of Hoffman, and as they say, the rest is history. We met May 4th, 1990, and had 31 wonderful years together of opera, symphony, and world travel. My relationship with this special man took me into a rich and magical world of opera that I will never forget. We created a life together filled with fabulous artists, directors, singers, and behind-the-scenes camaraderie and a common love of the art form that Ernesto dedicated his life to, opera. For 31 years, we lived together in our little white house in Montlake, where we would entertain people from all over the world, from near and far, with formal dinners and barbecues. Life with Ernesto was an education and a school in and of itself. We went to so many rehearsals and performances. We attended every opera for 31 seasons. Even when Ernesto's memory faded, he still loved to attend opening night of the opera, always in his classic tuxedo and a youthful smile. Ernesto came into my life when I had very little direction and gave me a wonderful life in the opera. He was always a true gentleman and a loving partner, so when he began to show further signs of dementia, I felt it a privilege to provide the care for him in the home that he loved so much. His love and support provided me with a great life, and my caring for him was my way of returning that love to him. Thank you, Ernesto, for all the joy you have given me and all those you have met. May your soul rest in peace. Thank you to all the people over the years who supported Ernesto and me in the last years of his life. I know that wherever there is music and opera being performed, Ernesto's spirit will always be present. See you at the opera.
Jonathan, that was truly beautiful. Friends, that's the end of the celebration. Jonathan cordially invites you to the lobby for some refreshments and continued reminiscences of our beloved Ernesto. Thank you for coming, and let's go toast Ernesto.